Now today, we are continuing on in our Moses series, kind of. You'll see what I mean in just a moment, because I actually want to drill down, dive a little bit deeper into something we talked about last week. See, last week we explored Moses and Aaron. They confronted Pharaoh. They said, God said, let my people go. And Pharaoh essentially says, thanks, but no thanks. And so God sends a series of 10 plagues, and it kind of culminates with the death of the firstborn in every house, from the house of Pharaoh to the house of slaves, even the firstborn of the livestock. And God doesn't just have this plague happen. He also provides a way out. And that way is through a meal. And that's the meal we read about in Exodus chapter 12. If you have your Bibles, we'll jump in Exodus chapter 12, starting in verse 1. It says, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month is to be the beginning of months for you. It is the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, they must each select an animal of the flock according to their father's families, one animal per family. If the household is too small for a whole animal, that person and the neighbor nearest his house are to select one based on the combined number of people. You should apportion the animal according to what each will eat. You must have an unblemished animal, a year-old male. You may take it from either the sheep or the goats. You are to keep it until the 14th day of this month, and then the whole assembly of the community of Israel will slaughter the animals at twilight. They must take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and the lintel of the houses where they eat them. They are to eat the meat that night. They should eat it roasted over the fire along with the unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or cooked in the boiling water, but only roasted over fire. Its head as well as its legs and inner organs. You must not leave any of it until morning. Any part of it left until morning you must burn. Here is how you must eat it. You must be dressed for travel, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. You are to eat it in a hurry. It is the Lord's Passover. Now, that's a lot of instructions that seem kind of boring, and we're like, okay, so what? This is instructions for a meal. But remember, this meal would be the thing that delivered God's people. It says this is the Passover meal. And a lot of times we think, okay, it's the Passover because the destroyer passed over the house. But the original Hebrew, it doesn't just mean like directionally passed over. It gives a sense of there is salvation. You are going to be saved through the act of this meal. And this meal became so important for the Israelite people that they actually had this meal every single year, and it was the thing that kick-started their year. I don't know about you, but like in our family, things kind of revolve around, we're thinking about the different holidays. We know Christmas comes at the end of the year and Easter's in the spring. Well, for the Jewish people, this meal was so important. It was the thing that kick-started their entire meal, and they would have it every generation. In fact, Jesus himself, growing up, would have celebrated this meal every single year. In fact, we do read about one instance where Jesus had the Passover meal, and that's with his disciples. Oftentimes we call this the Last Supper. And so what I want to do today is I want to look at the story of Jesus' last Passover, and I want to see what does this mean for us. Because what Jesus does, you're like, okay, we're talking about Jesus, the series called Moses, right? What Jesus does is he takes this story about Moses and the Exodus, and he flips it and makes it all about himself. So I want to dive in this morning, Luke chapter 22. We're going to start in verse 7. And it says that the day of unleavened bread came when the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John saying, go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover. Where do you want us to prepare it? They asked him. Listen, he said to them, when you've entered the city, a man carrying a water jug will meet you. Follow him into the house he enters. Tell the owner of the house, the teacher asks you, where is the guest room where I can eat the Passover with my disciples? Then he will show you a large furnished room upstairs. Make the preparations there. So they went and found it just as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover. So let's set the scene here, because this is actually what Jesus does is pretty awesome. So remember, just a few days earlier, he has come into Jerusalem and they were worshiping him. They were excited. They're like, yes, Jesus is finally here to free us from Roman oppression. He'll reestablish Israel as this great nation. Like God's kingdom is here and Jesus will be our king. Now, when you start using kingly language, all of a sudden the Roman political leaders' ears perk up. And now they have reason to get rid of Jesus because the last thing they want is another revolutionary on their hand. And it had been a long time ago that Jesus had already ticked off the religious leaders, the Pharisees. And we know that one of his own followers was about to betray him, right? Like Jesus, everything is culminating. It's coming to the end of his life. And all of this attention is on him. So he can't just go and have the Passover meal. So his instructions read like something out of a spy novel. He tells his disciples, I want you to go find a man carrying a water jug. Follow that man to a house. You will talk to the owner of that house. You will ask him, where can the teacher have his Passover meal? He will show you a hidden upper room that will be furnished, and you will prepare the Passover meal there. I mean, like, Jesus is desperate to have this meal. And so desperate that he's not just going to miss it because there's a lot of heat on him. He's going to do whatever it takes. Think about all the planning and preparation it took just for them to gather together for that meal. Now, here's a little Bible nerd fact. This is one of the only stories that's found in all 4 gospel accounts. But what's interesting is that John says that Jesus died when the Passover lambs were being slaughtered. And here, that's when Luke starts talking about the Passover meal happening. So what's going on? And probably the best way for us to think about this is that for first century Jewish people, their day started at sunset. And so what's likely happening is normally Jesus might have had this meal at 2 or 3 in the afternoon, but he's actually going to have it at sunset the day prior. So it's still the same day, but not the same calendar day. Does that make sense? So let's just say hypothetically, like our day starts at midnight. Let's say hypothetically, I'm going to be arrested for tax evasion. Okay, I am not going to get arrested for tax evasion, but let's say I was. And I knew that they were going to come sometime on Thanksgiving Day. But you guys know Thanksgiving is my favorite holiday. And so I'm going to get my family together, and as soon as the clock strikes midnight, let's have our last Thanksgiving meal together, because I don't know if I'm going to make it till 2, 3, or 4 the next day. That's what Jesus is doing here. It's that important for him to have this meal. He's gone through all of this trouble and preparations. He wants to have this meal. Why is it so important? Because again, he's going to use this whole meal, and he's going to use it to teach his disciples something about him. Now, what I would like to do this morning is I would like us to share in a Passover meal together. And not all of us can participate, but I will ask if I have 1 or 2 volunteers who want to join me on stage. We will walk through Jesus' Passover, and I will give you this caveat. You need a little bit of an adventurous palate. So if you're a picky eater, like, remember, this meal was not just about having good food. It sent a message. So do I have anybody? If not, I'll eat by myself. That's a sad place to be. All right, come on up. I have one more over here. All right, come on up. Oh, buddy, this is going to be bad for you. All right, come on up, come on up, come on up. All right, now, you notice our table is low to the ground because when we think of the Last Supper, this is usually what we think about, right? This picture. There we go. A couple things are wrong with this. Number 1, Jesus wasn't white. Okay, so let's bear that in mind. Number 2, they're not sitting at the high top tables. And number 3, they wouldn't have all been just on one side of the table. Actually, the table would have been U-shaped. We don't have that. But the table would have been low to the ground. So we're going to eat low to the ground. You guys can join me. Sorry, dude. You volunteered. All right, by the way, this is Daniel and Josh. Everybody give them a round of applause. There we go. All right, so now how we would normally do this if we were with Jesus, we would actually be reclining on our left arm. We'd have our feet out to the back. I'm not going to make you do that. If you want to do that, you can. There you go. All right, I am not going to do that because I have a lot of stuff I have to do with my hands, but you're welcome to.
Look at Daniel.
Well, you can.
I'm looking at you, man.
There we go. All right, so we're all going to kind of participate in this meal together. Now, I have to ask, are you 21? I am. All right.
You got to take the cup.
Oh, you're right. Will you take it off for me? Are you 21?
Yeah.
All right. Well, it's sparkling grape juice either way, because I had to do this for 2 services, and it's still a little early. All right. Here we go. Look at that. Daniel. No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
21.
I am definitely 21. I'm the oldest one on this stage right now. You got to, yep, there you go. You're going to want a little bit. There we go. You might want to top yourself off there. And the reason is because the Passover meal is actually structured around 4 promises that God made to the Hebrew people. So if you remember from last week, in Exodus chapter 5, Moses and Aaron go and confront Pharaoh. And they said, Yahweh says to let his people go in the wilderness so they can worship him. And Pharaoh says no. And not only that, but he makes life even more difficult for the Hebrew people. He says, you're not going to get straw anymore for your bricks. Like, you're going to have to gather that. We're going to beat you. We're going to raise your quotas. Like, everything gets worse for the Hebrew people. And so then they start complaining to Moses. Said, Moses, you're supposed to be here to save us, and you've made things worse. And then Pharaoh's also ticked off because he's like, why would you insult me by coming with this request? So Moses goes back to God and is like, what the heck, God? Why did you set me up for failure? Like, everything has gotten worse. And in Exodus chapter 6, God is reassuring Moses, like, listen, I knew this was going to happen. I'm still going to deliver you. And in Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 and 7, we get the 4 promises that actually shape the structure of this Passover meal. God says, therefore, tell the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from the forced labor of the Egyptians and rescue you from slavery to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and great acts of judgment. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. You will know that I am the Lord your God who brought you out from the forced labor of the Egyptians. So in these verses, we get the 4 I wills, or the 4 promises of God. He says, I will bring you out of Egypt. I will set you free from slavery. I will redeem you, and then I will take you as my own. And there's so much we could say about those, but here's where we'll leave it for today. Throughout the meal, you would share in the cup 4 different times. And each time you had the cup, there would be this blessing. So normally the meal would begin, Jesus would start, and he would sing this blessing in Hebrew. I'm not going to do that for 2 reasons. Number 1, I will butcher the Hebrew. Number 2, none of you want to hear me sing. So what we're actually all going to do, I'm going to invite everybody here. We're going to recite this blessing together, and then we'll have our first cup. May you be blessed, Lord our God, King of the world, who creates the fruit of the vine. Bottoms up. Not all the way. You're going to need that. Trust me. All right. Now, at this point, we would do something called the dipping of the karpas. So, gentlemen, I want you to grab that clear liquid right there, and I want you to rip off some of that lettuce. So we're going to dip in. I will tell you what the liquid is. The liquid is salt water. All right. I told you, adventurous palate. All right. So just dip it in, get it in there, and then let's eat it. So good. So good. Well, yeah. So what is up with the karpas? Well, the idea behind this is it would actually call back to mind the story of Joseph from the book of Genesis. So if you remember Joseph, he has 11 brothers, and he is his dad's favorite. How do we know he's his favorite? Well, his dad gives him a gift. Do you guys remember what gift his dad gave him? The Technicolor dream coat. And not only that, but Joseph then starts telling his brothers, I've had all these dreams where you guys are bowing down and serving me. Isn't that awesome? Not so much. So his brothers finally have enough. They're ready to kill him. A few of them say, let's pump the brakes here. Let's just sell him into slavery. And then when they sell him into slavery, they take his coat, they rip it up, and then they kill an animal. Pop quiz. Does anybody know what animal they killed? It was a lamb. Whoever said that, great job. You get the gold star. Might have been Blaine, who was also in first service, so he already knew the answer. Took a lamb, and then they took the blood of the lamb and smeared it on the Technicolor dream coat, took it back to their dad and said a wild animal killed Joseph. And so Joseph, long story short, ends up as second in command in Egypt because he's the only one who can interpret Pharaoh's dreams. And then a famine hits. They're prepared in Egypt because of Joseph. His brothers are not. So they head to Egypt. They don't know where Joseph is. And when they show up on the scene, we get this story that's awkward but beautiful. It's this reconciliation. And Joseph and his brothers settle down in Egypt. And so all of that happens at the beginning of the Passover meal to remind us of how did the Hebrew people get to Egypt to begin with. Like that kind of salty, stinging flavor is almost like when you bite your lip and you can taste the blood in your mouth. It's a reminder of the blood of the lamb that was on Joseph's coat that led the people into Egypt. Now, at this point, the youngest child would begin to ask a series of questions. Now, we've already established we're all over 21. We're grown men, all right? We are not the children today. You guys are all going to be the children. And the children ask this series of questions. It's the same questions they would ask every year. And so I'm going to give you the count of 3. I want you guys to ask the questions. But here's the thing. I know you. And I know you're going to be tempted to go, why is this night different from every other night? That's not how kids ask questions. Have you ever been around a kid on a holiday? Like, it's Passover, everybody's here. Like, you got to be excited and energetic, and you're going to ask questions in the wrong order and everything else. So when I count to 3, I want you guys all to ask the questions, give me some good energy. They can be in different order. I don't care, but I need you guys to be the best kids you possibly can, all right? So we're going to count to 3. 1, 2, 3. I'm glad you asked. So at this point in the story, the host would start to read from the book of Exodus. There's a shorter version in Deuteronomy chapter 26. I'm not going to read the whole thing because we've been in this story for the last month. So I'll essentially summarize that we know that the Hebrew people then settled down in Egypt. And they became fruitful and multiplied. God's blessing was on them. But a new Pharaoh comes to power, and he didn't know Joseph. And so for him, these Hebrew people have become a threat. And so he actually enslaves them to control them. But despite the fact that he enslaved them, guess what? They continued to be fruitful and multiply. So then he tells the Hebrew midwives, I want you to go kill all the Hebrew baby boys that are born. And they come back and they say, man, these Hebrew women, they're giving birth faster than we can make it there. And then that doesn't work. So he says, all right, anybody in Egypt, if you see a Hebrew baby boy, throw it in the Nile. Now, there's one particular Hebrew woman. She gives birth to a baby boy. She hides him for 3 months. When she can't hide him anymore, she does put her son in the Nile, but not before first putting him in a basket and settling that basket in the reeds, where that baby is discovered by none other than the daughter of Pharaoh, who looks at this baby, who has compassion, adopts him as her own, and gives him the name Moses. So Moses grows up in Pharaoh's palace, this life of luxury. And then one day when he's 40 years old, he decides, I want to be with my people. And so he actually goes out to see the Hebrews. When he encounters an Egyptian who's beating one of his fellow Hebrews, he looks around to see, is anybody going to do something about this injustice? And when nobody does, he steps into action. He hits the Egyptian and kills him. And because of that, he essentially has a warrant out for his arrest. So he has to leave Egypt, where he settles down in the wilderness. He has a wife, he has a child. And for 40 years, he's tending to his father-in-law's flock. When at 80 years old, one day, as he's out in the wilderness with his flock, he sees a bush that's on fire, but it's not being consumed. It's burning, but it's not being burned up. And from that bush, God begins to call, Moses, Moses. I've heard my people cry. I've seen their oppression. I'm ready to move. I'm going to deliver them. Not only that, but I will bring justice on the Egyptians. I will lead my people to a land with abundant resources, a land that's big enough for all of them and their descendants. And because of that, I want you to go and to tell Pharaoh to let my people go. So Moses and Aaron do this, and as we've already talked about, Pharaoh refuses, so God sends a series of 10 plagues. The 10th was allowing the destroyer to come through Egypt and take the firstborn in every house. But on that night, the Hebrew people shared a meal, the same meal that we're having today, and it was through that meal that our people were saved. And it's at this point, after the telling of the story, we would raise our glass for the blessing of the second cup, and we would also sing a song. We're not going to sing a song, but we're all going to do this responsive reading together. This comes from Psalm 113. So I'll read the leader part, and then all of us will read the all part. Sound good? All right. Praise Yahweh. May the name Yahweh be blessed now and forever. From the place where the sun rises to the place where it goes down, may Yahweh's name be praised. For Yahweh is high above the mountains. His glory is higher than the heavens. Who can be compared to Yahweh, our God, who is enthroned on high? He stoops to look down on the sky and the land. He lifts up the poor from the dust and the needy from the slums. He sets them among princes, even princes of his own people. May you be blessed, Lord our God, King of the heavens, who creates the fruit of the vine. Now, at this point, we would begin the meal portion. If you remember from Exodus 12, there's 3 things that had to be present for it to be a Passover meal. You had to have lamb. Remember, lots of instructions on the lamb. Then you had to have unleavened bread. Then you had to have bitter herbs. Now, interestingly enough, the lamb was referred to as the body. But when you read the account of Jesus, it's noticeably missing that there's no lamb at that meal. And I wonder if it's because Jesus knows that he is the lamb that's about to be sacrificed. And so we get to this interesting part in the story where in Luke chapter 22, verse 19, Jesus says this, he took the bread, gave thanks, broke it, gave it to them, and said, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. So he takes this unleavened bread. Unleavened bread is interesting. What is unleavened bread missing? Yeast. Now, why would they have to have unleavened bread? Well, because listen, on the night of the first Passover, they had to eat like ready to go. Did you hear it said have your sandals on? That's why I wore my sandals today. You had to have your staff. You had to have everything ready to go. You're eating this meal quick because at any moment, Pharaoh would relent and God would finally set his people free. So you didn't have time to wait for the yeast to rise. You just had to be ready to go. And what's interesting is there's no body there. There's no lamb. And Jesus said, this is my body. And guess what? Just like that lamb is sacrificed, my body is about to be broken. And every time you have this meal moving forward, I want you to do this and think of me. Now, guys, I wish I could tell you this next part's going to be fun, but it's not. Because you didn't just eat the unleavened bread, you would dip it in bitter herbs. So go ahead and let's grab our other container here. I will tell you this is horseradish and not sauce. That stuff dilutes it. It's just straight. I chopped it up myself. And so we are going to eat some bitter herbs, and I'm going to tell you, go a little easy. Oh, gosh. I mean, it depends. Yeah, good.
Now I'm nervous. Can I go back for a second?
Yeah. All right, I gotta have a little wine here.
I don't feel it.
All right. So the idea behind these bitter herbs is it actually refers back to Exodus chapter 1, when it said that when Pharaoh put the Hebrews into slavery, that it was bitter slavery. And the idea is that when you eat this, like when I cut this up, it was like an onion. Like my eyes were watering, and it should bring tears to your eyes. It reminds us of the time when our ancestors were enslaved. Like it's the bitterness of their slavery. Now, in this room, none of us are slaves in Egypt, but we all know what it's like to be slaves to sin and death, slaves to our own desires, slaves to addiction, slaves to things we wish we would stop doing, but we keep falling back into old cycles and habits and patterns and behavior. We all know what it's like to be a slave to sin and death. And when you have this meal, it should remind you of the bitterness of slavery, but it would also remind the people that later on in their history, guess what happened? They became like Pharaoh. They enslaved other people. See, slavery is something that hurts us, and when we enslave or hurt others, it's a different type of slavery. It's the idea that we've all been both the oppressed and the oppressors. We've all been like Pharaoh, gods in and of ourselves. And so it's a reminder that we need freedom from our slavery. Now, at this point, we will get to Luke chapter 22, verse 20. It says, in the same way, he took the cup after supper and said, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. So this third cup would have reminded them of the blood of the lamb that was smeared on the doorpost. And they would actually enter, and we talked about it last week. It was anyone who was inside the house marked by the blood was safe from the destroyer. And in a sense, that blood started a covenant with God's people, this relationship that they were safe when they were covered by the blood of the lamb. And Jesus says, but this cup represents my blood, which is about to be poured out. And anyone who finds their rest and hides their life in me will be safe and set free from sin and death. So he would have raised the glass and say, be blessed, Lord our God, King of the heavens, who creates the fruit of the vine. Now at the end of the meal, there would have been one more cup. And this cup was called the cup of praise because they would sing songs, lots of singing, which we're not going to do any of that. But it was also came to be known in Jesus' day as the cup of protection. And it's that cup that Jesus looks at and says, I'm not going to drink of this cup until I drink new with you in my kingdom. And the disciples have to be thinking, wait a second, Jesus, you need protection. Remember the Romans are after you? The Pharisees are coming after you. You just told us that one of us is going to betray you. You need protection. And Jesus lays down that protection so he can go and do what God had called him to do, that he would be the lamb that brings us peace. And in Matthew chapter 26, it just ends. They sing the hymn, and then they leave the Passover meal. That concludes our meal. So give it up for Daniel and Josh. Thank you, guys. So at this point, I will go ahead and open it up to Q&A. If anybody has any questions, we didn't get any text-in questions, so if you have a question, you can raise your hand. If not, we'll be fine. All right. Yes, they still celebrate the Passover. Now, their Passover meal looks very different. I shouldn't say very different. This is a very stripped down version. If you've ever been a part of a modern day Seder, there's definitely other parts that have been added in. Likely Jesus would have had some kind of stripped down version of the Passover like we just shared today. Great question. Anybody else? That's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer, so I'll have to go back and check out on it. Do you know the answer?
From things I have heard and read, it's that God is starting your day with rest, which is different than how the secular world would start the day, right?
Yeah.
That day before God first gives rest. It's kind of remembrance of the law.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I think it makes total sense too, because Sabbath was supposed to be celebrated on the first day of the week. You actually live your life from a place of rest. You're not working to get to a place of rest. That's great. That's awesome. I think it's interesting too, because they actually then start their whole year with this Sabbath meal, right? Like that's how they're living their entire year in light of what God had done in Exodus. And I got to think that wasn't always easy, because remember, they would have this meal throughout times where they could look over at the Canaanites and see how successful they were. They would live in a time where they were oppressed by the Babylonians, the Persians, even Jesus was there, and they're oppressed by the Romans. And there's a lot of stories that the world was telling them that maybe the Canaanite gods are better. You know what? Maybe God had forgotten them. Maybe God was done with them. Maybe he was finished with his plan for them. There were a lot of lies that they could have believed. And so they have this meal every year. It's not just a meal that they experienced, it's a meal they participated in, because this meal would have regrounded them in the truth of who God is and the truth of who God said that they were. Listen, if God set our people free in the past, he will set us free again. If God was faithful before, he will be faithful now. If he didn't forget us then, he won't forget us today. I think all of us maybe walk in here today, maybe believing some lies. See, one of my favorite quotes is, the most dangerous lies are not the ones you believe, but the ones you live. Because we start to internalize these lies as like who we are. So we believe like, I'm unlovable. So we keep people at an arm's length and then wonder why no one's close. We say, well, it must be because I'm unlovable. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Maybe some of you have walked in here today and you're believing the lie that your failure is what's going to define you for the rest of your life. You're believing the lie that God would never want to use you or call you. You're believing the lie that God has forgotten you, that he didn't answer your prayers in the way that you anticipated, and so maybe he's just done with you. There's all of these lies we come in here with, but I love that Jesus has this expectation that his followers would continue to have this meal as a way of regrounding themselves in the truth of who he is and who Jesus says that we are. So we have communion each and every week, and I wish that it was as fun as this is, but it's a cracker and some juice. But it really is a moment for us to encounter the body and the blood of Jesus. And that when we participate in that story, we remind ourselves that Jesus died to set us free. In fact, Dr. Tim Mackey from the Bible Project has drawn this parallel here. He says the Passover story is a story that through the Lamb, Yahweh delivers the Hebrews from oppression to Egypt. But in Jesus' Passover, it's through Jesus, Yahweh delivers all people from oppression to sin and death. And so I don't know what you walked in here with today, but maybe for some of us, there's some ways we've become Pharaoh, a god in and of ourselves, and maybe today's a day to set that aside. Maybe you've come in believing lies about yourself or about God, and not just believing them, but living them, and today's the day to set those aside and reground ourselves in the story of who Jesus is and who he says we are. So we're going to continue with the time of communion. And our prayer stations will be open up front. You can write prayers on those cards and put them in the prayer jar. You can light a candle, because throughout church history, that's represented praying to God. But I want to do something a little different as well. If there's an area of your life where you're starting to become more like Pharaoh, or if there's a lie that you've believed, I would invite you to write that on a piece of paper and put it in that jar and leave it here. that when we walk out of this place, we walk knowing that our lives are covered by the blood of the Jesus. He died to set us free from sin and death, and he's working in our lives to make us more like him. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes with me? Jesus, we're thankful that you passed on the cup of protection, that you went to the cross, that your body was broken, your blood was poured out. And I pray today for any of the areas where we've become Pharaoh, we've become the God of our own life. We repent of that today. We surrender that to you. I pray for the lies that we've believed that have changed how we live. We surrender those. And we cling to the truth of who you are and who you say we are. And I pray that as we draw near to you, you would draw near to us. You would meet us here in this moment. Help us become more like you. It's in your name I pray. Amen.